My fiancée and her mother planned our entire wedding without me, then threatened legal action when I canceled everything publicly. My phone started vibrating before I had time to sit down. It buzzed against the kitchen counter, slid an inch closer to the edge, then buzzed again. I watched it happen like I was outside my own body, detached, slow to react. I already knew what it was about. The cancellation had been live for less than an hour, and the silence I'd expected never came. Instead, it arrived like a flood. At first, the messages sounded confused. People asked what happened, why things changed so suddenly, whether this was some kind of misunderstanding. I didn't answer. While I stood there scrolling, the tone shifted. Confusion turned into frustration. Frustration hardened into blame. Everyone seemed to agree on one thing. I had done something wrong, and now it was my responsibility to fix it. The calls started next. Missed ones stacked up from numbers I recognized and others I didn't. Some left voicemails that sounded rehearsed, like they had already discussed what to say before dialing. Others were short and sharp, telling me to call back immediately. No one asked how I was doing. No one asked why I felt the way I did. They spoke as if the wedding were a machine I had shut down without permission. Then I saw the message that changed everything. It was long, carefully written, and calm in a way that didn't match the situation. Somewhere in the middle, between mentions of deposits and embarrassment, a sentence stood out. It warned me to think carefully about the consequences of my actions. It mentioned contracts. It mentioned money already spent. And then it mentioned what steps might be taken if this wasn't handled properly. Legal action. I read it twice, then a third time, just to be sure I wasn't imagining it. My chest tightened, not from fear, but from clarity. That word didn't belong here. Not in a conversation about marriage. Not in something rooted in love or commitment. The moment it appeared, everything else fell into place. The noise around me kept growing, but inside, something went quiet. I realized no one was reacting to losing me. They were reacting to losing control. The plans, the image, the story they had already shared with everyone else were slipping away, and I was being treated like the problem for not playing along. I set my phone down and stepped back. In that stillness, the truth finally surfaced. This wasn't a relationship unraveling. It was a structure collapsing. And the second I refused to stand where they needed me, it stopped being about partnership and started being about force. The engagement itself felt simple in the best way. There was no audience, no production, no pressure to turn it into a story for other people. We were sitting together, talking about nothing important, when the moment shifted without warning. I remember the way her voice changed when she realized what I was asking, how her hands shook as she nodded yes before the words even came out. It felt private, shared, untouched by expectations. In that moment, I believed we were choosing each other freely. The weeks that followed were full of warmth. We talked about the future in loose, hopeful ways, never locking ourselves into details. Everything was framed as something we would build together, where we might live, how we wanted our days to feel, what kind of life made sense for us, not for anyone watching from the outside. When the word wedding came up, it was always paired with phrases like our pace and what feels right. Nothing sounded rushed or imposed. It felt mutual. I trusted that tone completely. I trusted the way she said we, without hesitation, how naturally she talked about compromise and balance. There was an assumption, quiet but strong, that decisions would be shared because that was the foundation we were standing on. I didn't feel like I was stepping into something uncertain. I felt steady, chosen, included. Looking back, I can see the first hints of imbalance, but at the time they barely registered. Small comments about her mother being excited. Casual mentions of ideas already floating around. None of it felt threatening. It all sounded like enthusiasm, like harmless input that could always be adjusted later. I told myself that was what support looked like. There was a subtle shift I couldn't name then, a faint discomfort that came and went before I could focus on it. I ignored it because everything else felt right. The trust was real. The optimism was real. And because of that, I didn't question where the momentum was coming from. I assumed it belonged to both of us, even before I realized it was already moving without me. Wedding talk didn't arrive as a serious discussion. It slipped in sideways, woven into everyday conversation like it was background noise. A comment here about timing, a passing remark there about how fast venues book up. Nothing was framed as a decision. It all sounded hypothetical, casual, easy to ignore. I nodded along, assuming these were just thoughts being aired, not plans being set in motion. Her mother started coming up more often around then. At first, it was harmless. She was excited. She had opinions. She loved planning things. I didn't see a problem with that. It felt normal for family to be involved, especially someone who clearly enjoyed organizing and talking through details. I assumed her role would stay on the edges, offering ideas that we could take or leave. No one said otherwise. The first moment that fell off was so small I almost missed it. We were talking over dinner when a date was mentioned, spoken confidently, like it had already been settled. I paused, trying to remember when we'd talked about it seriously. I asked a simple question, light and curious, about how that date was chosen. The answer came quickly, without hesitation. It just worked better. There had been availability. It made sense. I smiled and let it go. That was the pattern. Every time something felt slightly wrong, I smoothed it over with politeness. I didn't want to seem difficult. I didn't want to interrupt the excitement. I told myself that details could always change later, that nothing was locked in yet. Trust filled the gaps where questions should have been. But the feeling lingered. Not loud, not sharp, just a quiet sense that I was being carried along rather than walking beside everyone else. Conversations kept moving forward without stopping to check if I was still comfortable. When I did speak up, even gently, the moment passed too quickly, as if my input was a minor pause rather than something that mattered. Looking back, that was the first real loss of agency. Not taken forcefully, not argued over, just eased away while I stayed polite. I chose harmony over instinct, assuming balance would return on its own. I didn't realize then that manipulation rarely announces itself. It starts by moving just fast enough that you don't notice you've stopped choosing until the choices are already made. The planning crossed a line without making a sound. I didn't get a call or a sit-down conversation. I found out the venue had been chosen in the middle of a casual exchange, mentioned the same way someone might mention a restaurant they liked. The name was said confidently, followed by details about how beautiful it was and how quickly it had been booked. I remember nodding automatically while my mind scrambled to catch up, trying to figure out when I had been asked for an opinion and somehow missed it. The date came next, announced with even more certainty. It wasn't framed as an idea or a proposal. It was stated like a fact that already existed. I asked, carefully, when we'd settled on that day. The answer was smooth and dismissive. It worked best for everyone. It lined up with schedules. It was easier this way. No one seemed to notice that I was hearing it for the first time. After that, the pattern solidified. Information flowed in one direction only. I received updates, not questions. I was told what had been booked, what had been discussed, what had been handled. Each message carried the same tone, cheerful and efficient, as if the lack of my involvement was a convenience rather than a problem. The assumption was clear. I didn't need to be part of the process to be part of the outcome. Confusion settled in first. I replayed conversations in my head, wondering if I'd agreed to more than I remembered. Then came embarrassment. Friends would bring up details I didn't know, congratulating me on choices I hadn't made. I laughed along, feeling exposed, like I was pretending to recognize a version of my own life that existed without my input. What hurt most wasn't any single decision. It was the realization that nothing was being discussed anymore. Everything was being presented. The momentum was deliberate and steady, moving forward whether I was comfortable or not. When I tried to slow it down, the response was reassurance instead of adjustment. I was told not to worry, that everything was under control. That was when it became impossible to ignore what was happening. Planning hadn't just moved ahead. It had moved around me. My role had shifted quietly from participant to obstacle, someone to inform rather than include. Standing there, reading another message about something already decided, I felt the weight of that exclusion settle in. This wasn't collaboration. It was a process designed to function whether I agreed or not, and I was only just beginning to understand how intentional that was. Her mother never raised her voice, and that was what made her so effective. Every sentence landed with certainty, delivered in a calm, practiced tone that left no room for debate. She didn't argue. She explained. And those explanations always ended in the same place, with a conclusion that positioned her judgment as final. When she spoke, it felt less like a conversation and more like a decision being announced after careful thought. Tradition became her strongest tool. She referenced how things were supposed to be done, how certain choices had always worked, how deviation only led to regret. These weren't suggestions framed for discussion. They were standards, presented as facts rather than preferences. If I questioned anything, even mildly, the response wasn't defensive. It was patient, almost kind, as if she were guiding someone inexperienced away from a mistake they didn't yet understand. Her experience was the unspoken authority behind everything. She had planned events before. She had seen marriages succeed and fail. She knew what mattered and what didn't. That knowledge was used to quietly shut down input without ever saying no outright. I wasn't told I was wrong. I was made to feel uninformed. My opinions weren't challenged. They were gently set aside as unnecessary. What stood out most was the absence of visible conflict. There were no arguments, no dramatic moments, no raised voices. The control operated smoothly, wrapped in reason and confidence. Decisions moved forward under the guise of practicality, and resistance was framed as emotional or impractical. It was difficult to push back against something that looked so composed on the surface. In that dynamic, the imbalance became clear. She held the center of gravity, and everyone else adjusted around her. My role shrank with each interaction, not through confrontation, but through quiet dismissal. I left those conversations feeling smaller, unsure why my input seemed to carry so little weight. It took time to recognize that this wasn't about guidance or help. It was about control exercised without noise, power enforced without anger, and influence maintained by making disagreement feel unnecessary and, somehow, inappropriate. She stayed quiet through most of it, and at first I told myself that silence didn't mean agreement. I assumed she was overwhelmed, caught between loyalty and love, unsure how to step in without making things worse. Each time her mother spoke over me or redirected the plan, I waited for her to say something, anything, that showed we were still standing on the same side. That moment never came. When I looked to her for reassurance, she offered small gestures instead of words. A glance, a weak smile, a squeeze of the hand under the table that felt more like an apology than support. Later, in private, she would say she understood me, that it was difficult, that this was just how her mother was. Those conversations ended with comfort, not change. The next planning discussion always played out the same way, and she remained quiet again. Conflict made her retreat. Rather than push back, she softened, letting decisions move forward without resistance. I realized she was choosing the path that caused her the least stress, even if it left me exposed. The tension didn't disappear, it simply shifted direction. Instead of facing her mother, she allowed the pressure to land on me, expecting I would absorb it. That's when the distance started to grow. I wasn't arguing with two people. I was alone in a room where choices were being made about my life. The partnership I thought we had began to feel one-sided, like I was present only in name. She listened to my concerns later, behind closed doors, but never carried them into the spaces where they mattered. The loneliness wasn't loud. It settled in quietly, built for moments where I felt unseen and unsupported. I stopped speaking as much, not because I agreed, but because I understood it didn't change the outcome. Watching her avoid standing up for us made something click. This wasn't a temporary imbalance. It was a preview of how decisions would always be handled, with me on the outside, hoping to be included in something that was supposed to belong to both of us. The tone changed the moment numbers entered the room. Until then, everything had been framed as ideas and preferences, things that could still be adjusted. That illusion ended when I was told how much had already been spent. Not discussed, not approved, but committed. Figures were mentioned casually, as if I had been part of the decision the entire time. Deposits were down. Contracts were signed. Backing out was described as impossible without serious consequences. I remember sitting there, listening, trying to catch up to a situation that had moved far ahead of me. Each amount carried an expectation attached to it. The message was clear without being spoken directly. This was now my problem too. I was informed that canceling or changing plans would mean wasted funds, damaged relationships, embarrassment. The conversation wasn't about affordability or fairness. It was about obligation. When I asked why none of this had been brought to me earlier, the response came wrapped in disappointment. I was told these things had to be handled quickly, that delays cost more, that everyone else had been excited and cooperative. My hesitation was painted as carelessness rather than concern. The language shifted subtly, placing weight on my shoulders without offering any control in return. Responsibility became a tool. I was reminded that weddings were expensive, that sacrifices were normal, that adults followed through once money was involved. It wasn't said angrily. It didn't need to be. The pressure was calm, steady, and relentless. I was made to feel unreasonable for questioning decisions that directly affected my finances and future. What unsettled me most was how trapped I felt. Saying no now meant being blamed later. Agreeing meant surrendering the last pieces of choice I still had. There was no clean option, only varying degrees of loss. Every attempt to slow things down was met with reminders of what had already been paid, already promised, already announced. In that moment, I understood the leverage. Money had entered the conversation not as a shared burden, but as a chain. It bound me to plans I didn't shape and expectations I hadn't agreed to. The celebration was no longer about commitment. It had become a transaction, and I was expected to comply, smile, and take responsibility for a situation built entirely without my consent. I asked to talk in private, away from planners, messages, and outside voices. I wanted a quiet moment where it could just be us, the people who were supposed to be getting married. I chose my words carefully, trying not to sound angry or accusatory. I explained how sidelined I felt, how decisions kept appearing fully formed, how the pace and pressure were making me uneasy. I said I wasn't trying to stop the wedding, only to feel included in it. At first, there was relief in finally saying it out loud. She listened, nodded, even agreed that things had moved quickly. For a brief moment, I felt hopeful. It seemed like this might be the turning point where we reset and approached everything together again. I talked about compromise, slowing down, maybe revisiting choices that didn't feel right. I wanted solutions, not conflict. But the response shifted away from action almost immediately. Instead of discussing changes, the conversation drifted into feelings. She talked about how stressed she was, how hard it was to balance everyone's expectations, how much pressure she felt from her mother. My concerns were acknowledged, but only as emotions, not problems to solve. Each point I raised was met with reassurance rather than adjustment. When I asked what we could do differently going forward, there was no clear answer. She said things would work themselves out, that it was too late to change much now, that I needed to trust her and let the process continue. The calm tone made it harder to push back. Nothing sounded hostile, yet nothing actually changed. The hope I walked in with faded quietly. I realized the conversation had circled without landing anywhere solid. I had been heard, but not acted upon. Leaving that room, I felt the weight of disappointment settle in. I had tried to fix things gently, honestly, and directly. Instead of progress, I was left with the same imbalance, now softened by words but reinforced by inaction. I found out the same way everyone else did. My phone started buzzing nonstop, notifications stacking faster than I could open them. Messages came in filled with excitement, congratulations, heart emojis, and questions I didn't know how to answer. Someone had posted the wedding online. A polished announcement with a confirmed date, location, and smiling language about a celebration that already felt locked in. My name was there, tagged, framed as if I had helped choose every detail. Friends congratulated me on the venue, the timing, even the theme. Coworkers stopped me to say how perfect everything looked. I nodded through conversations that felt unreal, listening to people praise decisions I had never made. Each interaction added another layer of embarrassment. Correcting them felt awkward. Staying quiet felt dishonest. I smiled because that was easier than explaining the truth. The shock wasn't loud. It settled slowly as I scrolled through comments from people I hadn't spoken to in years, all reacting to a future I hadn't agreed to. Seeing it made public removed any remaining doubt. This wasn't miscommunication. It wasn't rushed planning. It was a deliberate move forward without my consent, now cemented by visibility. What hurt most was the lack of hesitation. There was no check-in, no warning, no pause to ask if I was ready. The announcement wasn't just news. It was pressure. Walking it back would mean awkward questions, disappointment, and blame. The public nature turned personal discomfort into a spectacle. Humiliation followed clarity. I finally understood that my role had been reduced to confirmation, not collaboration. The control I thought I still had was gone, replaced by expectations I never agreed to carry. Watching strangers celebrate something that felt wrong inside me was the moment everything snapped into focus. This wasn't about sharing a life. It was about presenting one, whether I belonged in it or not. The decision didn't arrive in a rush. It formed quietly, in the space after the noise faded. I sat alone and thought about what had already happened, not just with the wedding, but with how easily my voice had been set aside. I imagined the future beyond the ceremony. Years of choices handled the same way, plans announced instead of shared, expectations placed on me without consent. The picture was clear, and it felt heavy. I realized that if I went along with this, I would be agreeing to more than a date or a venue. I would be accepting a role where my boundaries were optional and my presence was symbolic. That understanding brought an unexpected sense of calm. The confusion I'd been carrying lifted once I stopped asking how to fix things and started asking whether I should. There was no anger in that moment, no urge to argue or prove a point. I thought about respect, about what partnership was supposed to feel like, and how far away that felt now. Staying quiet to keep peace suddenly seemed more damaging than any conflict that might follow. I understood that postponing the choice would only make it harder later. The answer settled in without force. I knew what I needed to do, even if I didn't yet know how the fallout would look. Canceling wasn't about punishment or control. It was about refusing to step into a future that had already been decided for me. That clarity steadied me. For the first time in weeks, I felt grounded. The fear of disappointing others mattered less than the cost of betraying myself. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was choosing, and that choice, made quietly and without witnesses, felt like the first real act of self-respect I'd had throughout the entire process. I didn't call anyone first. I didn't ask permission or float the idea privately. I knew that if I tried to handle it quietly, the story would be told for me. So I chose clarity over comfort and wrote a short public message. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't accuse or insult. It simply stated that the wedding was canceled and that the plans no longer reflected a shared decision. I explained that moving forward wouldn't be honest, and honesty mattered more than appearances. My hands shook while I typed, but my words stayed steady. I avoided emotional language on purpose. No blame, no backstory, just facts. I didn't want sympathy or sides. I wanted my voice back. Hitting publish felt like stepping off a ledge without knowing how far the drop was. For a few seconds, there was silence, and then everything exploded. Messages poured in immediately. Some were confused. Others were concerned. A few were supportive without asking questions. I didn't respond right away. I let the statement stand on its own. That space felt important. For once, I wasn't explaining myself in private while a different version lived publicly. What people read was what I meant. Relief came first, sharp and unexpected. The pressure that had been building for weeks released all at once. I could breathe again. That relief didn't last long before fear rushed in behind it. I knew this would trigger consequences. I knew there would be anger, accusations, and attempts to regain control. But even with that knowledge, I didn't regret the choice. The finality settled slowly. Watching the post sit there, unchanged, made everything real. There was no going back to pretending things were fine. No more smiling through plans that excluded me. Whatever happened next would happen in the open, not behind closed doors where my silence could be mistaken for agreement. I felt exposed, but also solid in a way I hadn't felt in months. The decision was no longer trapped in my head. It existed in the world, clear and undeniable. The fallout hadn't arrived yet, but I knew it was coming. Still, as I put my phone down, one thing was certain. For the first time in this entire process, the narrative included me, exactly as I was, without edits or permission. The shift didn't happen all at once. At first, the responses were coded in sadness and disbelief. Messages framed the cancellation as a mistake, something driven by stress or nerves. I was told everyone was hurt, that people were confused, that this could still be fixed if I acted quickly. The disappointment felt heavy but familiar, like I had let them down by stepping out of line rather than by ending something broken. That tone didn't last. Within a day, the language changed. The words became sharper, colder, stripped of emotion. References to feelings disappeared and were replaced by terms that didn't belong in conversations about marriage. Obligations, commitments, consequences. I reread those messages slowly, trying to understand how a personal boundary had turned into something transactional. Blame followed soon after. I was accused of embarrassing them, of causing unnecessary damage, of creating problems that could have been avoided if I had simply stayed quiet. The focus wasn't on why I felt pushed aside or unheard. It was on how my choice affected their image, their plans, their sense of control. Every sentence carried the same message, even when phrased politely. I had failed to play my role. Then the threats appeared, almost casually, as if they were reasonable next steps. Words like contract and liability were dropped into conversation without warning. I was told certain actions could have repercussions, that deposits had been placed, that people had relied on promises, that walking away came with a price. Reading those lines made my stomach drop. This wasn't concern. This wasn't heartbreak. This was leverage. Betrayal settled in quietly. I realized that support had always depended on compliance. Affection had been offered as long as I didn't resist. The moment I stepped out of alignment, the warmth vanished. What remained was calculation. The realization hurt more than the threats themselves. Love, I understood then, had been conditional. It existed only while I stayed agreeable, silent, easy to manage. Once I chose myself, I became a problem to solve instead of a person to care for. That clarity didn't bring comfort, but it brought truth. And truth, even when painful, finally made everything make sense. I didn't respond right away. Instead of arguing or defending myself, I reached out to someone who had no emotional tie to the situation. I laid out the messages, the wording, the sudden shift in tone. I expected to hear that I had made a serious mistake or that I was in danger of real trouble. What I got instead was calm clarity. I was told to slow down, breathe, and look closely at what was actually being said. Once everything was reviewed, the picture changed fast. The dramatic language didn't match reality. There were no signed agreements, no binding documents, no shared accounts, no legal ground that justified the fear being pushed onto me. What I had received wasn't a plan for action. It was pressure designed to scare me back into place. Hearing that out loud felt like air returning to my lungs. The intimidation lost its weight almost instantly. Messages that once made my chest tighten now looked hollow. The confidence behind them vanished when I realized how fragile their position really was. Control depended entirely on my panic. Without it, there was nothing left to hold me. Something inside me shifted after that. The urgency faded. I stopped rereading every line, stopped imagining worst-case endings. Emotional distance formed naturally, not out of anger, but understanding. The situation no longer felt dangerous, just revealing. For the first time since everything fell apart, I felt steady. Not triumphant, not cruel, just grounded. Fear had been the last tool they had, and it only worked while I believed in it. Once that illusion broke, the power dynamic collapsed quietly. I didn't need to fight. I didn't need to explain. I simply stepped back, and the noise lost its meaning. I stopped replying without announcing it. There was no final message, no explanation, no closing argument. I simply didn't answer anymore. Calls went unanswered. Notifications stacked up and stayed there. At first, it felt strange, like holding my breath on purpose. Then it felt quiet in a way I hadn't experienced for months. Without my responses, the story around me began to change. Explanations were offered on my behalf, none of them accurate. I was described as overwhelmed, confused, dramatic, or ungrateful. Each version shifted slightly, depending on who was listening. What stayed consistent was that my voice was missing from all of it, and that absence unsettled people more than any argument ever had. Questions started coming from others. Friends asked why I wasn't around. Relatives wondered why plans suddenly felt awkward. Invitations slowed, then stopped. People didn't know how to place me anymore without a narrative handed to them. I let that discomfort exist without fixing it. It wasn't my job to manage how they explained my choice. What surprised me most was how calm life became. Days felt longer. Evenings weren't filled with tension or second-guessing. I noticed small things again, like sleeping through the night or enjoying meals without anxiety sitting in my chest. Emotional safety arrived quietly, not as excitement, but as relief. There was no revenge in the distance I kept. No satisfaction in watching confusion spread. The separation wasn't meant to punish anyone. It was simply space where pressure couldn't reach me anymore. Silence became a boundary that didn't require enforcement. In that quiet, I learned something important. Peace doesn't need permission. It doesn't come from winning or being understood. Sometimes it comes from stepping away and letting people sit with the stories they created once you stopped playing your part. Looking back, the wedding itself was never the real thing at risk. What almost disappeared was my sense of self inside a relationship that called itself a partnership while operating like a hierarchy. I confused inclusion with love and compromise with erasure. It took everything falling apart to finally see the difference. A union should feel shared, even during conflict. It should allow room for disagreement without punishment. What I experienced instead was direction masked as tradition, authority disguised as care, and affection offered only when I stayed compliant. The plans weren't built with me. They were built around me, assuming I would bend to fit whatever shape was already decided. Canceling the event felt like failure at first. I mourned what I thought I was losing. A future, a promise, a version of myself that believed patience would eventually be rewarded. But that grief slowly transformed. I realized I wasn't walking away from love. I was stepping out of a structure that never intended to hold me equally. The lesson didn't arrive loudly. It settled in quietly, during ordinary moments when no one was watching. I noticed how much lighter decisions felt without asking permission, how natural it was to speak without rehearsing, how peace showed up when control left the room. Those changes told me more than any apology ever could. Self-worth didn't come from being chosen. It came from choosing myself when it mattered most. From recognizing that commitment without respect is not devotion, and unity without voice is not connection. I didn't lose a wedding. I gained clarity about what I will never accept again. Strength, I learned, doesn't always look like standing your ground in a fight. Sometimes it looks like walking away without drama, without revenge, without needing the other side to understand. It looks like closing a door gently and trusting yourself enough not to reopen it. The quiet afterward wasn't empty. It was honest. And for the first time, that honesty felt like home.